Welcome to Past People. Please subscribe to support these videos. The body of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is remembered today as the woman who lost her life at the command of her husband, King Henry VIII. She was his second wife, but not the only spouse to meet a gruesome end on Tower Green. After Anne's execution, she was interred in a chest meant for arrows, hidden beneath the floor of St. Peter and Vicula, the chapel within the Tower of London's grounds. It wasn't until the chapel underwent renovations during the Victorian era and the graves were unearthed that the grim secrets of the past were revealed. Join us today as we explore the tragic aftermath of Anne Boleyn's life, and please support our channel by subscribing. Anne Boleyn's fall from grace came swiftly as she met her end at the edge of a French sword in a carefully orchestrated downfall by the infamous Thomas Cromwell. Anne and Henry had secretly married in January 1533, a move that caused such a commotion that Henry VIII severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. England entered a dark and tumultuous period marked by religious turmoil that would last for a generation. Initially, Anne and Henry were happy, engaging in a courtship before their marriage. Anne experienced several pregnancies, but only one resulted in a healthy child. Multiple miscarriage and Henry's desire for a son led him to look elsewhere for love, and Anne was no longer the desired wife. Henry had found affection elsewhere, particularly with Jane Seymour. To marry her, he needed a reason to end his current marriage, and this is where Thomas Cromwell entered the picture. There was no love lost between Anne and Thomas, and he made it his mission to ruin the Queen. Ultimately, Anne was accused of high treason, leading to her imprisonment in the Tower of London on the 2nd of May 1536, where she was then put on trial. Anne was convicted of incest, treason and adultery, and on the 19th of May 1536 she met her tragic end. Before her execution, Anne was confined within the Tower, the same place where she had been just 3 years earlier for her own coronation. On the day of her execution, Anne was brought to Tower Green, where the scaffold had been erected, ready and awaiting her and the executioner. While on the scaffold, she gracefully addressed the people, her voice somewhat weakened by her ordeal, but gaining strength as she spoke. She pleaded with them to pray for the king, whom she had always found kind, and the spectators couldn't hold back their tears. After bidding farewell to her ladies and attendants, there was not a dry eye in the large crowd. It was at this moment that Anne confronted her executioner. The skilled swordsman from France then carried out his duty, swiftly severing Anne's head with a single stroke to the back of the neck, shocking the witnesses. Many across England believed Anne would find her place as a queen in heaven, including Thomas Cranmer, a staunch supporter of Anne. Normally, the remains of those executed within the Tower and on Tower Hill were placed in an arrow chest and buried inside the chapel of St. Peter and Vicula. The church itself is a Tudor chapel and serves as a final resting place for many of the Tower of London's most famous prisoners. Anne, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, her husband Lord Guildford Dudley, George Boleyn, and many others found their rest here. Anne was the second person to be interred in front of the high altar of the chapel during the Tudor period and the reign of Henry VIII. 13 notable men and women would follow her and her brother to their graves inside this chapel of the building. In the Tudor era, individuals executed for treason were typically not commemorated with headstones or celebrations of their lives. Their resting places remained unmarked. However, there was a record kept of Anne Boleyn's burial place. A Tudor chronicler wrote at the time of another Tudor execution that the corpses, along with their heads, were buried in the chapel in the tower at the high altar. A floor plan of the chancel's interments shows Anne lying to the left of the altar. Then, during the era of Queen Victoria, the chapel where Anne is buried became the focus of renovations. It was during her reign that extensive restoration work was carried out, not only on the decor but also on the heating systems. Plans were set in motion to refurbish the chapel, but the restoration efforts inadvertently led to the desecration of some of the most prominent graves. Queen Victoria was deeply troubled to discover that the chapel had been repurposed as a meeting room, a practice that she strongly disapproved of. Consequently, she ordered the comprehensive restoration of the building. A multitude of enhancements were made to the modest church, as Queen Victoria believed that the place was neither suitable nor appropriate for the burial of royalty and other high-ranking individuals. It was during these renovations that the chapel's floor needed to be lifted, and the builders realised that they had to exhume the bodies of those who rested near the altar and the high chancel. The church's pavement had sunk and become uneven, and upon lifting the flagstones it was apparent that the bodies buried within the chapel walls during the Tudor and Stuart periods had suffered repeated desecration. The floor was subsequently relaid, but the area in front of the altar where Anne Boleyn lay remained untouched initially. The plan was to leave the chancel undisturbed, but significant alterations were deemed necessary, leading to the exhumation of Anne Boleyn. On the 9th of November 1876, while the world outside went about its business oblivious to the events within, the body of the Queen was exhumed. Anne had been interred for 300 years at this point, as careful excavation work commenced at a depth of about 2 feet. Anne's remains were discovered. The bones had all accumulated together in one location. Disturbingly, the grave had previously been tampered with. Anne Boleyn's burial spot had been disrupted due to the collapse and decay of the coffin of a 54-year-old woman named Hannah Beresford, who had been buried in a similar location back in 1750. It was determined that the cause of the pavement's collapse was this earlier burial, which had also disturbed Anne's final resting place. A surgeon named Dr. Frederick J. Mote, along with his team, meticulously and forensically documented Anne's remains. He described her as a female aged between 25 and 30, with a delicate frame and slender, perfectly proportioned body. Her forehead and lower jaw were small and well formed, with particularly small vertebrae, including one joint called the atlas, which was adjacent to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's slender neck. Further examination revealed that the bones of her head indicated a well-formed rounded skull with an intellectual forehead, a straight habitual ridge, large oval eyes, a square face, and a rather square, full chin. The remains of her vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicated a well-formed woman of average height with a short, slender neck. The ribs displayed depth and a roundness indicative of a well-shaped chest. The bones of the hands and feet suggested delicate and well-shaped extremities with slender fingers and narrow feet. All the individuals involved in Anne's exhumation were certain that it was the remains of a female. After the remains were carefully unearthed, they were entrusted to the Tower's governor, who stored them inside the Queen's house, his residence. 2 days later, additional bodies were discovered, including those of Jane Rochford and Margaret Pole. Anne's bones indicated that she stood around 5 feet or 5 feet 3 inches tall, and confirmed her cause of death as beheading. Anne's body would remain in the Queen's house for another 5 months before being reinterred. On Friday the 13th of April 1877, 7 men, including the resident chaplain of the chapel, gathered inside the chancel at midday. This time, their purpose was to lay the bodies to rest in specially crafted lead caskets. Each of these caskets was constructed with thick lead and held together with copper screws within oak plank boxes, approximately 1 inch thick. An etching on the coffins displayed their names and the year of their death, along with the date of their reinterment. Records of their burials were also noted, and a decorative floor now marks the location of these graves. The identity of the remains discovered has been a subject of long-standing debate. Regardless of the truth, Anne has become a pilgrimage destination for many individuals around the world. Visiting her and the other individuals buried within the chapel evokes a profound sense of reverence and reflection. A moment of contemplation fosters great respect for the bravery and courage of those within the chapel's walls during their final moments, and instills hope that the events of the past are never repeated. Today, Anne Boleyn is viewed by many as a martyr, a woman whose life was unjustly taken from her by the ruthless men who ruled the country at the time. She faced an unjust death sentence, but her legacy endures. Unable to provide Henry VIII with a male heir, Anne's daughter Elizabeth went on to become one of the greatest queens in history, a remarkable defiance against the man who ordered her mother's execution. Thank you for watching, and to show your support, please subscribe to Past People. The afterlife of Catherine Howard. The tragic fate of Catherine Howard unfolds as we delve into the events surrounding her execution and its grim aftermath. Catherine Howard, the fifth Queen of Henry VIII, faced a gruesome end due to accusations of adultery against the king, both before and during her marriage. Despite her youth, her death was a brutal, heart-wrenching, and ultimately unjust one. In this narrative, we won't dwell on the reasons behind Catherine's demise. Instead, we will focus on the day of her execution and the harrowing events that followed her death. Join us today as we explore the horrifying posthumous experiences of Catherine Howard. To support our channel, please subscribe. Catherine received the news that her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday, the 13th of February, 1542. She was instructed to prepare herself spiritually for her impending death, which was set to occur at 9 o'clock the following morning. The night before her execution, Catherine devoted hours to fervent prayer. It is also believed that she practiced placing her head on the execution block to prepare herself mentally. Catherine even requested the block to be brought to the chamber so she could familiarize herself with it, a request that was granted. On the fateful morning of the 13th of February, Catherine rose early and made her way from her prison chamber to the scaffold erected for her execution. Witnesses reported that she appeared terrified and pale as she approached. Catherine's fear was palpable, and she required assistance to climb the scaffold stairs. Once on the platform, she was so weak that she could barely speak. Despite her distress, she acknowledged that she deserved 100 deaths for offending the king, who had shown her great kindness. She implored all Christian people to recognize the justness of her punishment for her transgressions against God and her continual defiance of his commandments and the king's royal authority throughout her life. Throughout history, there has been a rumor that Catherine uttered, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," while on the scaffold. However, her fear had overwhelmed her to the point that she struggled to speak clearly. The executioner then provided her with a blindfold, which she placed over her eyes. As Catherine had rehearsed the night before, she knelt down and positioned her head on the block. A large crowd had gathered to witness her execution, and there was an audible gasp as the executioner, wielding an exceptionally sharp axe, prepared to strike. In one swift and horrifying moment, the executioner severed Catherine's head from her body. At this moment, the executioner, in a gruesome display, lifted Catherine's head by her hair and removed her blindfold. He raised her lifeless face before the crowd and declared, "God save the king." Afterward, Catherine's lifeless body was entrusted to her attendants, who covered her with a sombre black cloak. She was then taken to the chapel of St. Peter and Vicula, a place constructed during the Tudor era. Within this chapel, a grim repository of historical truths about the era lies. Here, not only Catherine Howard, but also Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey rest, all queens who met their demise and suffered injustices at the hands of those in power. However, the victims within the chapel extend beyond the queens, as many more who lost their lives during Tudor monarchy and interred there. Within these hallowed walls, secrets are unveiled, and Catherine's story does not conclude with her execution on the orders of King Henry VIII. Instead, it takes a more sinister turn. Even before her death, Catherine was subjected to treatment that showcased the king's lack of affection for her. When compared to Anne Boleyn's death, both brutal in nature, Anne was afforded a swift execution by a French swordsman, while Catherine faced beheading by a blunt axe. Anne's scaffold was adorned with luxurious velvet and expensive fabrics, while Catherine's was merely covered in straw and hay to absorb her blood. Catherine was denied even a cushion to kneel on, and her royal titles were stripped from her before she left Hampton Court Palace. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting shrouded her body in black cloth and carried it into the chapel for burial, but there was no grand ceremony, no ornate chest for her interment. Instead, she was unceremoniously cast into a grave without a funeral. However, the cruelty didn't end there. What followed was sadistic and inhumane. Allegedly, when Catherine was buried and wrapped in her cloak, a substantial amount of quicklime was callously shovelled into her grave. It is believed that Henry VIII ordered this action. The consequence of this was the gradual dissolution of Catherine's body and remains, reducing them to near nothingness. It is almost as if someone wished for all traces of Catherine Howard to be obliterated from this earth, as if the king wanted her memory and history erased as if she had never existed. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel where Catherine Howard was interred underwent significant renovations. Queen Victoria was greatly disturbed to discover that the chapel was being used as a meeting room, a purpose she found wholly inappropriate. Consequently, she ordered extensive restoration work for the chapel. The small church was substantially improved, as Queen Victoria believed it was not suitable for its intended purpose, nor was it befitting for the burial of royalty or other high-ranking individuals who rested there. During these restoration efforts, the chapel's floor needed to be lifted, prompting builders to exhume the bodies of those laid near the altar and the high chancel. Among those whose remains were uncovered were individuals who had been executed within the walls of the Tower of London. Skilled doctors managed to identify some of the bodies, including that of Anne Boleyn and several others, such as Margaret Pole and Lady Rochford, who had been executed shortly after Catherine Howard. Once identified, these bodies were carefully placed in boxes and relocated for safekeeping while the renovations proceeded. However, what perplexed the builders was the absence of any remains that could be attributed to Catherine Howard. It had been assumed that she was buried in close proximity to the high altar due to her societal status. Typically in churches, the most significant burials are beneath or near the altar. The absence of Catherine Howard's remains strongly suggests that quicklime was used to accelerate her decomposition after her execution. In close proximity to the resting place of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, several eroded bones were discovered, possibly due to the effects of lime, but they could not conclusively be linked to Catherine Howard. To this day, Catherine's remains remain undiscovered. Nonetheless, inside the chapel of St. Peter and Fecula, next to Anne Boleyn's resting place, Catherine's cousin, there lies a plaque displaying her coat of arms and bearing her name. Quicklime, a potent chemical, would have quickened the decomposition process if it was used on Catherine's body, leaving little trace of her remains. It is truly heart-wrenching to contemplate the fate of Catherine, who in her youth became a victim of the ruthless and infamous King Henry VIII. While it cannot be denied that her relationship with Thomas Culpeper was inappropriate, it became evident that she shared more common ground with the courtier than with the grotesque king to whom she was wed. The Victorians lent credence to the theory that Catherine's remains were concealed with quicklime. However, some historians propose an alternative possibility, suggesting that her body might have been misidentified as Anne Boleyn's. Catherine's life was marked by horror, sadness, and brutality, but her treatment following her death can only be described as abominable, terrifying, and reprehensible. The memorial marker within the chapel serves as a tribute to the former Queen Consort. However, the truth remains that although Catherine's body was never recovered, there is a possibility that she rests somewhere beneath the church floor, a place yet undiscovered. Catherine met her tragic end at the hands of an executioner under the orders of a tyrannical king when she was just 18 or 19 years old. She was a young woman filled with potential, a stark reminder of what might have been had she never crossed paths with the king. Unfortunately, her marriage proved to be a catalyst for her transformation into a tragic victim, subjected to the malevolent forces at play. Afterlife of Catherine Parr. The life story of Catherine Parr extends far beyond her famous marriage to King Henry VIII, which marked her as the sixth and final wife in his series of marriages. Catherine's journey began long before her union with Henry and continued well after his reign. Catherine's lineage was distinguished, as she was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal, an esteemed official in the royal household. She was born around 1512 and had a remarkable lineage. Her matrimonial history commenced during her teenage years when she wed Sir Edward Burgh of Gainsborough Hall. Tragically, he passed away in 1533, prompting Catherine to marry John Neville, the middle-aged 3rd Baron Latimer of Snape Castle in North Yorkshire, a year later in 1534. During the tumultuous events of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, Snape Castle was seized by rebels, leading to Catherine and her stepchildren being held hostage and facing threats of death. The Baron Latimer managed to secure their release by capitulating to the rebels' demands. Sadly, he passed away in 1543, leaving Catherine a widow at the age of 30. Despite her widowhood, Catherine remained slender, vibrant, and attractive. She yearned for a love-filled marriage before her youth faded away. Her heart's desire was Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's third queen, Jane, who died in 1537 after giving birth to Prince Edward. However, instead of Seymour, King Henry sought Catherine's hand in marriage. Catherine and Henry eventually tied the knot at Hampton Court in July of 1543. Their connection ran deep, as Catherine and her mother had served as ladies-in-waiting to Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon. Furthermore, Catherine later served in the household of Princess Mary. Catherine Parr was renowned for her love of vibrant attire and finery. Described as possessing a lively and charming appearance, she earned praise for her virtuous character. In 1544, she was noted for wearing a sumptuous robe of cloth of gold with a brocade petticoat, adorned with sleeves lined with crimson satin and trimmed with luxurious crimson velvet. Her train extended more than 2 yards, and she adorned herself with 2 crosses and a jewel featuring exquisite diamonds. Her headdress was adorned with numerous beautiful pieces, while her gold girdle featured large pendants. Catherine possessed tact, allowing her to wield a positive influence on King Henry during his later years. Close bonds formed between Catherine and her stepchildren, and she dedicated herself to their education, making her a cherished figure in their lives. Although Henry and Catherine's marriage was not initially rooted in love, there are clear signs that it did evolve into one of genuine affection, especially towards the end of King Henry's life. As his health deteriorated, Henry experienced increasing discomfort, bordering on agony. During this time, he became convinced by the pro-Catholic faction at court that Queen Catherine was a dangerous heretic conspiring against him. Fortunately for Catherine, a well-wisher leaked the arrest warrant to her. She cleverly and swiftly used her wit to persuade the king that when it came to matters of faith, she relied solely on his guidance and answers. This swayed Henry, who then berated the officials sent to arrest her as incompetent. Catherine and Henry's friendship was rekindled, and it remained strong until his passing on the 28th of January 1547. Not wanting to waste time and eager to be with the man that she loved, Catherine, after a 6-month mourning period, married Thomas Seymour. However, what began joyously ended in tragedy as Catherine succumbed to a slow and painful death. She had given birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, who was just 1 week old when Catherine died of perpetual sepsis. Mary is believed to have been raised by Catherine's closest friend, Catherine Willoughby, the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk. Unfortunately, Mary also died in early childhood. Following her death, Catherine's body lay in repose at Sudley Castle for a period of time. Her remains were then carefully wrapped in wax-treated cloth and placed in a snug-fitting lead coffin. The soft lead bore the inscription of "KP here lieth Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry VIII and wife of Thomas Lord of Sudley, High Admiral of England and Yorkshire to King Edward." A sermon was delivered by Miles Coverdale, and Lady Jane Grey served as the chief mourner at her funeral, which is considered one of the first Protestant services of its kind in England. For over 200 years, Catherine rested peacefully beneath Sudley Chapel. However, as the estate and the church above her fell into despair, she remained remarkably well preserved. In the summer of 1782, Mr. John Lucas, who occupied the land of Lord Rivers where the chapel ruins stood, respectfully opened the top of Catherine's coffin, expecting to find only her bones. To his astonishment, he discovered her entire, uncorrupted body wrapped in 6 or 7 layers of sheer linen, despite being laid there for 230 years. Driven by unwarranted curiosity, he took it upon himself to cut through the delicate cloth covering Catherine's arms, only to find that her skin still retained its pallor and moisture. Mr. Brooks, who documented this in the book The Opening of the Queen's Grave, expresses disapproval of Mr. Lucas's actions, considering it sufficient to have merely discovered the Queen's final resting place and reported it to the appropriate authorities. It is believed that around this time, hair clippings and a swatch of fabric from Catherine's burial attire were taken. The following summer in 1783, his lordship's business required him and his son to be at Sudley Castle. Upon learning of Lucas's previous actions, he ordered the earth to be once again removed out of personal curiosity. To his astonishment, he found Lucas's accounts of the coffin and corpse to be accurate, with one notable difference. Catherine's body had deteriorated significantly, with the flesh around the incision turning brown and putrefying due to exposure to the air. The noxious odour made his son ill while copying the inscription on the lead coffin. Subsequently, it was decided to place a stone slab over the grave to prevent further unauthorised inspections. Unfortunately, poor Catherine's body was disturbed again in 1792 when her coffin was dug up by drunken revellers and reburied upside down. 25 years later, Lord Chandos decided to move Catherine to a more secure tomb. Reverend John Lates, overseeing chapel repairs, and Edmund T. Brown, a local antiquary, discovered the coffin on the 18th of July 1817. The coffin was found upside down in a walled grave, and upon examination they found only the bare skeleton with a few pieces of sheer cloth remaining under the skull. They also discovered a dark-coloured mass containing a small amount of hair, matching some that they already possessed. Ivy roots, which had grown profusely on the chapel walls, had penetrated the coffin, filling much of it. They painstakingly nailed together the various pieces of lead that had been cut from the coffin over time to reconstruct its original form, placing it on 2 large flat stones beside the former Lord Chandos. Dr. Nash remarked that the Queen must have been of short stature, as the lead enclosure for her corpse measured only 5 feet 4 inches in length. This height was considered average for a woman in the late 1500s, aligning with the descriptions of Catherine as neither tall nor petite during her lifetime. Brown concluded that the ancient chapel that had been desecrated underwent a thorough restoration under the guidance of Sir John Gilbert Scott. As part of this renovation, a magnificent decorated altar tomb, crowned by Gothic canopy, was erected on the north side of the sacristy in memory of Queen Catherine Parr. Her effigy on this tomb was crafted as accurately as possible based on the existing portraits, with the alabaster image providing a lifelike appearance to her bare bones. With the final resting place and the fitting tribute to Queen Catherine Parr, her eternal rest had truly begun. Thank you for watching, and to support my channel, please consider subscribing.